Thank you, Emily, and thank you all for turning up so early, even if it wasn't with the additional impetus of getting up at 6:30, which for me was 3:30 where I come from, so I had to take a miss on that. Now, I'm in awe of Nigel Thrift, a leading-edge social science thinker, as well as being somehow in his day job the Vice-Chancellor of a major research-intensive university, world-leading university. And I'm also in awe of Catherine Moore, who has the best TED talk ever on the web, and whose PowerPoint display on TED inspired me to do something that probably is about 10% of what she did. So my PowerPoint will never compete, Catherine. I'm in awe of these two groups, Oxygen and Hewakatanaka, the way in which you organise yourself, young leaders in a country that's both young geologically and very much young in spirit. And so to you, you two groups, and to Emily and Stephen, fantastic occasion. And also to Marg and her conference secretariat team. You may not be in the room at the moment, Marg and your colleagues, but thank you for making this a real experience. Now, we all know the joke about how every Kiwi who leaves to live in Australia raises the IQ on both sides of the ditch. And so I won't tell you that one, but I do come from Brisbane, and no, it's not the fourth best city in the world, unfortunately, unlike Wellington. And you may not know the one about Barry Humphries, the well-known cross-dresser and impresario who used to tell the story about Australia being the Brisbane of the world. But I won't leave you with that one either. But here's a real life story. On an occasion of a large commercialisation conference in Brisbane a few years ago, the chair warmed up the audience with a great story. How many scientists, he asked, were there in the audience? And lots of people put up their hands. And then he asked how many lawyers and managers and accountants there were in the audience, and quite a few people put up their hands. And then he said how many arts people are in the audience, and me and a few other stragglers put up their hands. And then he said, well, welcome to the scientists. They tell us why things work the way they work, and it's good to see all the accountants and lawyers here, because they tell us how things work. And the arts people say, do you want fries with that? Now, I think we've moved on some time and some distance down the policy road since then. But it is true that the humanities, arts and social sciences have tended to live in a parallel universe to that of the science, technology, engineering and medicine, or what we like to call STEM, as distinct from HAS. So humanities, arts and social sciences, STEM. If I use these terms today, you'll know what I mean. It's tended to live in a parallel universe to that of the STEM knowledge cluster. And ever since, I suppose, and perhaps before the declaration by C.P. Snow in the 1950s that we're living in two cultures, in effect, parallel universes. Your own Ernest Rutherford was one of the featured figures in C.P. Snow's famous Two Cultures paper, and I quote from it. Literary intellectuals, he said, at one pole, and at the other scientists, and as the most representative, the physical scientists. Between the two, a gulf of mutual incomprehension, sometimes hostility and dislike, but most of all, lack of understanding. And compare, C.P. Snow said, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang but a whimper, the famous T.S. Eliot line. Incidentally, he says, one of the least likely scientific prophecies ever made. Compare that with Rutherford's famous repartee. Lucky fellow Rutherford, always on the crest of the wave. Well, I made the wave, didn't I? Said Rutherford. So C.P. Snow goes on, the non-scientists have a rooted impression that the scientists are shallowly optimistic, unaware of man's condition. On the other hand, the scientists believe that the literary intellectuals are totally lacking in foresight, peculiarly unconcerned with their brother men, in a deep sense anti-intellectual, anxious to restrict both art and thought to the existential moment. Now, it's my view that this parallel universe is being addressed significantly by the innovation framework. And I believe that the innovation policy framework gives the arts and humanities and social sciences the best overarching opportunity to reframe and refresh the arguments and evidence for their role and value of our disciplines in relation to the STEM cluster, the science cluster. And so first, let me defend against those who usually my colleagues in the arts and humanities, who accuse innovation policy frameworks of being another manifestation of what we too readily ascribe to the catch-all concept of neoliberalism. Innovation systems, I think, are a relatively recent public policy framework, which have really only been in place for a couple of decades. And that means that they are still in a state of real contestability. They're contestable precisely because they undercut the logic of so-called neoliberalism, those rationales for small government, deregulation, and for getting out of the way and letting markets work. Innovation policy has been made in a context in which Western governments have reintroduced themselves to an active interventionary role in a number of areas where they spent a lot of time getting out of in the 70s and 80s. The innovation policy framework is a value-driven orientation to productivity rather than a cost efficiency driver. And in that sense, it's in contrast to microeconomic reform rationales, again, the mantra of small government rhetorics of the 80s and 90s. It's also contestable innovation because for Treasury officials, it's usually regarded as industry policy by another name and therefore highly suspect. But I think that it does represent innovation thinking. It does represent a historic shift in the way that government has thought of an appropriate role for intervention. It's led to a disposition to focus on knowledge-based industries, on upskilling and education of the population, and a focus on universalising the benefits of connectivity through mass ICT literacy and infrastructure upgrades. And I would assert that any progressive scholar would support such initiatives. Government's role in innovation systems is to help to map and coordinate the system, facilitate linkages where they're inadequate, or bring them into existence where they don't exist. On innovation, they attend to system failure, not market failure. Well, having said that, we're still left with the parallel universe problem. But I think three factors are causing some convergence between these parallel universes. Firstly, the social sciences, working closely with engineering and technology specialists, have generated a great deal of evidence for the interdependence of knowledge production, knowledge management and transfer, giving rise to claims in the literature of a so-called fifth generation or ecological approach to innovation. This research and scholarship has demonstrated the necessary interdependence of STEM and HASS. The OECD Bible, the Frascati Manual, has been updated recently to take account of what is now approaching mainstream thinking. Science now seeks out, particularly the social scientist, in a more holistic cross-disciplinary handshake. And there is certainly some reciprocation. Secondly, innovation thinking and policy has been mugged by reality. And that reality is the industry reality that advanced economies are overwhelmingly services-based. And thus, there must at least be a framework for services innovation in policy thinking. Most services sector innovation is not dependent on breakthrough science, but on incremental and local efficiencies, attention to process, and increasingly to R&D and business models, which are taking greater account of the demand side and of innovations generated by users and consumers. In Australia, the Bureau of Statistics data shows that 65% of innovation expenditures are not science-based R&D, and that 71% of innovative firms do no technically defined by Frascati, no R&D. There's clear evidence that most of this is services-based and process innovation initiated and operationalised by personnel and applications derived from the humanities, arts and social sciences cluster. Thirdly, the thoroughgoing internationalisation of innovation policy, its take-up not only in the OECD but elsewhere, has meant the emergence of different approaches that have broken out of the path dependency on Frascati and the Oslo frameworks. Some of the most dramatic examples of this relate to countries such as Brazil and India, who've developed their own autarkic approaches to Western patented medicines. So where are we now? I think the social sciences have come into their own as a result of the converging path of the parallel universes. The intellectual leadership and scholarly heavy lifting that's got us to where we are has largely been in the province of the social sciences, in business, geography, economics, etc. But it's also those spheres of economic activity in society, particularly the knowledge-intensive business services, and those that are integrally interdependent with major sectors of high value-added manufacturing, that are populated largely by those in the social sciences. However, I think the arts and humanities are yet to nail their relationship to innovation thinking and remain problematically related without a convincing enough framework yet. Some of this has got to do with the different knowledge modes, and we're well aware of this. If you think about it, there are three basic knowledge modes in the literature: the scientific, which is predictive and universalizable; the humanistic, which is interpretive, explicit and analytical; and the practice-oriented, which is interpretive, intuitive and adaptive. These differences make connecting to innovation thinking, and with its history of close alignment to science, seem to many in the arts and humanities a category mistake. It's also a reason for the broad-based skepticism in the arts and the critical traditions in the humanities and social sciences, which eschew reduction to what they might regard as narrow, scientifically defined categories like innovation. Or you can have the opposite tendency, and that is the too ready assertion, particularly in the arts, that all artistic and creative practice is intrinsically innovative and therefore deserves attention as pure output, unrelated to economic gain, social benefit, or other assumed or needed derivatives of the innovation process. But the major model of the relation between the arts, humanities, and social sciences and science is the so-called handmaiden model, where, to put it most brutally, we become available as the PR firm for science. Science communication is very important, of course, and fundamental knowledge breakthroughs on this model are to be communicated effectively to a largely uncomprehending and therefore unappreciative public, who, if only they understood better, would support more science. One of the problems with the handmaiden model, of course, is that the public can form quite firm views about science, and sometimes they're quite anti-science. Think of the GM debates, the nuclear energy debates. But the biggest problem with the handmaiden model is simply the lack of parity assumed in it between STEM and HASS. Now, I think that there's some very important evidence that's coming through in the policy domain that's changing this kind of thinking. Substantial space, I think, has been created recently for the role that can be played by strategic investments in the arts and humanities. In particular, I'm looking at that just at the moment, within an innovation framework. The European Science Foundation is an interesting model because for the European Science Foundation, in principle, there is parity across the natural, the human, and the social sciences. Indeed, the European definition of science and research eliminates the implicit differences because of the terminology. Natural, human, and social sciences sit on par with each other. We're also I think also in Britain it's interesting the creation from 2005 of the Arts and Humanities Research Council has created a new space for arts and humanities work in relation to innovation. It's shown a great capacity and appetite for strategic investment in interdisciplinary and larger scale cross-sectoral projects, and a very strong emphasis on knowledge transfer. And NESTA, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, which was, I think, pleasingly excluded from the savage cuts that hit a number of the arts-related organisations on the 20th of October this year. NESTA has done good work over 10 years in developing an applied research agenda around arts and creative industries, and not only developed the policy arguments and frameworks, but also invested in startups that bring together technology, business and creatives. I think in this country, very interesting work that developed from 2002 with the Growth and Innovation Framework, which gave, in principle, parity to biotechnology, ICT, and creative industries, that gave birth to the Better by Design framework that started from 2004, a program of embedded design in manufacturing, and has produced very impressive results in this country of embedded creativity in manufacturing, so much so that it's been pinched by Queensland, and now last week announced Victoria, the state of Victoria announced a $5 million investment in a strategy of embedded design. These are all homages without acknowledgement to the New Zealand's Better by Design program. And in Australia, in my country, there's been some real progress towards linking culture, arts and innovation. The Creative Industries Innovation Centre, CIIC, which was a centrepiece of the Labor Party's arts policy in 2007, is now an integral part of Enterprise Connect, a national emerging industries innovation support network. The government's vision for a CIIC, a Creative Industries Innovation Centre, was based on our university's Creative Industries Precinct. And the centre that I lead, the ARC Centre of Excellence for Creative Industries and Innovation, was also another example of national investment in this agenda linking culture, arts and innovation. So I think a number of interesting developments in policy, and I think also in practice. I'm going to say a little bit about a report that the Council for Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, which I was the president of from 2006 to 2008, and remain on the board of as immediate past president. This organisation, a national advocacy body for the humanities, arts and social sciences, produced a significant report a few years ago called Collaborating Across the Sectors. It was a significant study of the ways in which STEM and HASP, where science and on the one side and humanities and social sciences on the other, have got together to produce nationally beneficial outcomes. The methodology for this study was, it was a reasonably big study. We spent $250,000 on it. An extensive literature review, a big survey, a significant national forum, lots of case studies and interviews. It hasn't been replicated since, and I'm not aware of a study like it anywhere else in the last few years. What are some of the examples that we came up with? Well, the Managing World Heritage example, the Greater Anchor Project, is providing new perspectives on Angkor in Cambodia, one of the most important cultural heritage sites in the world, bringing together historians, archaeologists, soil scientists, paleobotanists, climatologists, and computer modelling experts. It's produced a new perspective on Angkor, which has brought archaeology and hydrological research together. There are implications for low-density urbanism globally arising from this project. There's a general information management system that's emerged from it for World Heritage sites, and a new project, Living with Heritage, has developed as a way of managing data collected at Angkor and other World Heritage sites. The example of music therapy and hospitalised infants. The effectiveness of music therapy on the physical and psychological development of vulnerable, long-term hospitalised infants was tested through a collaborative project between the Marks Auditory Laboratories at the University of Western Sydney and the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. Long-term care of infants in hospital has focused on their medical needs, but what about their developmental needs for ongoing physical and psychological well-being? This project used music therapy interventions as a way of dealing with their isolation over the long term, and analysed the developmental factors that are affected when music therapy is used with babies in neonatal intensive care. New media industries. Now, a report came out a week or so ago that said that the internet accounts for 7.2% of the UK economy. Google funded this research, so you might take it with some degree of skepticism. But let's not for a moment diminish the creative destruction wrought by the internet. Internet has upset a huge range of industry business models. And the links between arts, business and technology is going to take us, as Nigel Thrift has argued in some of his writings, into the next phase of capitalism, where consumption and production blur, and where new business models based upon the feedback loops in what was thought of as very much a linear production to consumption chain are being radically remade. The case of obesity in Western countries. There are now more people in the world suffering from obesity than suffer from malnutrition. It's a huge problem and it's growing rapidly. Unless we find a solution to obesity in our younger generations, the life expectancy of parts of our populations will go down, despite all the advances in medical sciences. Obviously, part of the solution to obesity lies in the health sciences. Better understandings of the effects of eating certain classes of foods, genetic factors which predispose some people to obesity. Some of it lies in medical treatments, stomach stapling, liposuction, etc. But the largest part, arguably, lies in education and behaviour change. Australia is the second most obese nation in the world. What a wonderful ranking to be high up on. And as governments contemplate what to do about this, public awareness campaigns and restrictions on fast food advertising become more and more difficult to avoid. Britain banned advertising on children's television some years ago. It had the unintended consequence of leading to the collapse of children's programming, the children's programming industry in that country. You deal with complex and often unintended consequences of policy decisions, but it's arguable that that consequence is something that can be borne, can be tolerated, given the beneficial effects of banning advertising of fast food on children's television. Now, from feast to famine, an example which you clearly don't have here in New Zealand, the problem of water shortage. Australia has just gone through an extremely damaging community response to the Murray-Darling Water Commission's report on what to do about over-allocation for irrigation communities of water being siphoned from the Murray-Darling system. We've seen evidence of communities that depend on that irrigation water burning copies of the draft plan in eerie recollections of Kristallnacht and other bad events in past history. And one of our leading agricultural economists, John Quiggin, has said, many of the problems we have seen are the result of poor communication and an excessively bureaucratic reliance on some of the statutory requirements for reporting by this commission. Other problems could be addressed by sensible policy responses to problems inevitable in dealing with the consequences of decades of largely failed policies. What he's pointing to is the need in policy making to attend to the human dimension of how one addresses desperate and cynical citizens whose livelihoods are on the line. You don't do that through producing bureaucratically correct reports, popping them out into the public realm and waiting for the citizens to burn them. You can do it so much better. And a case that in preparing for this conference, I came across Anne Salmon's wonderful speech, I think to the Royal Society here, in which she talks about the epistemological divide between science and the humanities, and a wonderful example that she uses here of a conference she was at in the Pacific. A marine biologist from Tonga, for example, whose work involved harnessing the power of inter-village competition to restore stretches of coral reef, getting the villagers themselves to develop the indicators of reef health and success in reef discovery. The bringing in of the community into solving science problems in science that are around us. I think it's a wonderful example of collaborating across the sectors. So this report that we did at the Council for Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, what were some of the factors that we were able to summarise from this research? Well, what were the ingredients for success? The fundamental driver was the preparedness, the personal qualities of those people who were interested in doing that kind of work. They had to be extremely flexible, really open. They had to be very patient. They had to have lots of imagination. This came through again and again. Obviously, funding was another major driver. The obstacles to collaboration across the sectors, again, they won't surprise you. We can summarise them as being about cultural, epistemological and methodological issues, resourcing issues, structural rigidity, and recognition and status. It does no good to underestimate the degree of difficulty in collaborating across the sectors. Quotes from some of the respondents: the approaches of empirical studies, hypothesis setting and deductive approaches are dominant in the biophysical sciences. The interpretive and constructivist approaches of social sciences don't mesh with this. Clearly, these are major issues that require more time, often more resourcing, and real patience and imagination to deal with. Pecking orders amongst disciplines make collaborations difficult, especially since so many respondents talked about the importance of mutual respect as a factor in successful projects. So, cultural differences. Secondly, resourcing issues. The current funding environment was seen by respondents as offering little encouragement and significant barriers for cross-sectoral collaboration. A project rooted in one discipline, said one respondent, and evaluated by people from that discipline gets higher scores than a project that seeks to integrate across disciplines. There's a limitation of highly qualified evaluators who can look at both the technical and social aspects of interdisciplinary projects. Third problem, rigidity, structural rigidity. The rigidity of structures in Australian universities and research organisations, the physical environments, the funding arrangements and the prevailing cultures are major barriers to bringing together the sectors. The fourth is recognition and status. The fourth impediment is the lack of a clear reward structure. The conventional reward systems in research are constructed along the lines of a single discipline. Promotion within a department or faculty, articles in discipline-based journals, funding provided by panels focused on a narrow range of disciplines. We all know these issues. They're pretty much universal. Involvement in multidisciplinary collaborations is not always viewed, said one respondent, as a career-enhancing move. Universities are still fundamentally rooted in disciplines, despite their attempts to move on from this. One respondent said, "I think in some ways it's politically dangerous to take on collaboration, even though the upper executive of universities want everyone to engage in post-disciplinary research clusters. In the ranks, there is a need to hang on to existing bodies of knowledge in the disciplines." So, what were the recommendations arising from this report? Well, firstly, promote a new mindset. Summits like this one, running hot, would be a great contribution and have been. I've seen lots of references over the last couple of days to the way in which Running Hot has really been designed to bring together and to affect collaboration across the sectors, and you're doing it very, very well. Programs like the Europe Cost Program is another example of that. Secondly, change research behaviour. Well, one of the key recommendations was the need for sub-quotas within funding agencies for such collaboration. Until you have money driving this, it will never happen. And so we certainly recommended sub-quotas within the funding bodies for collaboration across the science and the HAS sectors. We didn't get very far with that recommendation, but we're going to keep pushing it because it's key, I think. Thirdly, educate for greater collaboration. Well, the recommendation was to limit hyper-specialisation in upper secondary school and the lower years of university. These are difficult to achieve, but there are many factors driving these kinds of moves. The so-called Melbourne model, which saw the University of Melbourne turn literally hundreds of undergraduate courses into 6 courses a couple of years ago, was a move very much in the spirit of delaying hyper-specialisation. And also, obviously, specialisation is very important at the degree level and also at the postgraduate degree level, but we also argued that there should be reintegration towards the end of a PhD program with some real emphasis on project management, collaboration, and real-world applications of the PhD students' research. Fourthly, train boundary spanners. We need to, as I say, reintegrate at the end of our research higher degree journey. And there should be some real focus on specialist programs at the postgraduate level for leaders who are interested in taking their research into collaborative domains. And finally, coordinate and advocate cross-sectoral collaboration. We argued for an institute for collaboration. Australia has an Institute of Commercialisation. That commercialisation should be intrinsically as well about bringing together HAS and STEM where appropriate. So an institute not only for commercialisation, but also for collaboration, and if necessary, one and the same institute. So there's a bit more as well. These weren't part of the recommendations of that report, but it would seem to me that it's very important that we contemplate schemes that build in impact and collaboration into the funding structures themselves. So what's happening with the Crown Research Institutes here in New Zealand, what happened with the large publicly funded research organisation in Australia, the CSIRO. Its flagship program was designed some years ago to bring about these collaborations. And at the Australian Research Council, there is a scheme called the Linkage Projects Scheme, which requires, in order to be eligible, that you bring in industry partners who support the project with both money and in kind. So building in collaboration, bringing in the question of impact into research schemes, the research funding schemes themselves. Now, the question of impact, which has been raised by Nigel yesterday, obviously he was referring to the Research Excellence Framework, which is in train in the UK, the possibility of a significant chunk of that being devoted to impact. Interesting development. We went through a process called the Research Quality Framework, which was very similar. It was going to be quality as well as impact. But in 2007, when the government changed in Australia, that was abolished, and ERA, Excellence for Research in Australia, was instituted, which got rid of the impact factor. And it is mooted that the PBRF here might start to consider questions of impact. Now, you've listened to me for quite some time, so here's a little bit of light relief. It's from the Times Higher earlier this year, when the question of impact was being debated, and still, of course, is in the UK. This is obviously one of the worries that people have about impact. The bright idea of the young scientist in the science news cycle turns into what it is. You can have a read of that for yourself. There's obviously concerns about impact. So that's one of them. And here, again, from the Times Higher, is another take on the question of impact. Does that sound familiar? But the question of impact, I think, is a very important one. And I think that one of the ways that it can be productively addressed, as I've just said, is about building impact into research project grant applications processes. I think that the ARC, the Australian Research Council's linkage scheme is a very good one, one which I've had about 12 grants in. And it's a very good one because it builds in the question of impact intrinsically into the research design itself. You're involving the industry partner from the get-go in the way in which you apply, and they have to put money on the line, they have to put in-kind on the line, and so you get impact built in to the process from the start. So I'd like to conclude with a few blue sky, or if looking at the image, more like deep space thoughts on the conceptual underpinnings of innovation. Leave you with those. In particular, the question of human and creative capital in innovation thinking. The theme of human capital or of creative capital is a very fundamental one in innovation thinking. It allows for an approach to disciplinary training that stresses the distinctive value of each for innovation, that is, each discipline, moving away from only a science-based priority around science training. It also goes to the centre of fifth-generation innovation thinking, where it is that dynamic linkages facilitated by personnel transfer and talent mobility ensure the flow between stock in the innovation system, the way in which you get residual resource, the stock in an innovation system, but how does it get activated? How does it get dynamised? It does not not principally through IP sequestration, but through talent transfer and talent mobility, people moving around the system. It's the domain where government is on its surest ground in defining its role in innovation through education and training and the derivatives of those. And it's also critical for the way in which it addresses both the supply side and the demand side of innovation. And I'm going to say a few things about the demand side of human capital. We know plenty about the supply side. We're all in the business of creating it through education. But what about the demand side of human capital? The demand side goes to the question, as the literature calls it, absorptive capacity. Critically trained, socially aware, sophisticated consumers who connect their buying habits with their identity as citizens, who play a critical role in demanding innovation and can cope with, respond to, and absorb innovation. They can appropriate, adapt technologies and new knowledge to their own ends in sometimes surprising, unintended, and innovative ways. This recognises the increasing claims around user-led innovation and collaboration as essential to knowledge solutions, but it also addresses key aspects of the role of arts and humanities in innovation. The humanities, I would argue, play a central and well-recognised role in slowing down scientific progress, insisting on and providing the ethical and other holistic approaches to the social implications and applications of knowledge. Examples like the ethics of stem cell research, of GM foods, etc. But the arts and humanities also can speed up social absorption of innovation by understanding, breaking trends, interpreting difficult and complex challenges to belief, custom and practice, and they give us the insights and frameworks to understand and absorb change. Design and fashion, for instance, speed up the absorptive capacity of the consumption base of society, priming the demand side of innovation. Large-scale, longue-durée shifts in human understanding have been fundamental to social change. One of the Arts and Humanities Research Council papers, Arts and Humanities Research and Innovation, has some telling examples of this, such as the role played by Charles Dickens in changing attitudes to the poor through the main organs of popular culture of the mid-19th century. When we think in these sorts of terms, a whole galaxy of examples present themselves. I think, for example, of the fundamental shifts due to the work of cross-cultural understanding from anthropology and ethnography in understanding Australian Aboriginal spirituality, social organisation and human agency in the face of settler colonialism. Reflecting on this, I think back to the porphyry yesterday that welcomed us, and I reflect on the strength and depth of Aotearoa New Zealand's biculturalism, even as the older countries of Europe struggle with the presumed end of the multicultural journey. The extreme pressure that multiculturalism is under in places like Germany, where Angela Merkel has recently declared it a, quote, utter failure, unquote, and where Nicolas Sarkozy is going down a similar path. And I think, I think of the strength and depth of New Zealand's biculturalism. And in thinking on this, I thank you all for the experience that I've had of these bright, beautiful, and beneficial days these last few days. So thank you very much.